listener production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of sexual assault and violence against women. Please listen with care.
Hello, I'm Dan Mullins, executive producer of Crime Insiders. Welcome to our Rewind series, where each Wednesday we feature an episode from our back catalogue. This week, a chance meeting at Sydney Airport that set off one of the world's most intense and effective gang operations and led to a string of law changes and high-profile convictions.
Former Superintendent Deb Wallace is a titan of New South Wales Police. She joined the job in 1983 and was one of just 8 women in a class of 100 at the academy. She was posted to a station in Blacktown as a uniformed constable, but it came at a devastating time for Sydney and Australia. Anita Cobby was sexually assaulted and horrifically murdered whilst walking home from Blacktown railway station.
The man in charge of that case at the local level was Detective Sergeant Graham Rosetta, who still today is my hero and still a strong mentor and a dear friend. Most murders are committed by people known to the victim. They're associated through social circles, family, whatever. They're the ones that detectives, and still to today, generally know where they want to take the investigation and just work on gathering the evidence once they discard lines of inquiry that aren't right. The random ones are the really hard ones. And I think Graham realised after about the second day that Anita's murder was a random type murder. So understandably, with the media, Graham had no leads to give them to keep it alive on the front pages, and he was scared that they were going to start to withdraw, understandably, to the next story. So he was so determined he needed the media to be engaged with him because he had nothing. And he was walking past me as he was going out into the backyard of the Blacktown Police Station just on his own, just to have some time, I think. And suddenly he stopped and he looked at me and he said, "Wallace, how old are you?" And I said, "I'm 24. He said, "How tall are you?" And I said, "I'm 5'8". He said, "Actually, I've got an idea. I want you to come with me." So I walked out of the station up to the detective's office, which was upstairs. And he put the proposition to me. He said, "Look, I've just had this idea and it's not been, I think today they've done it some other times, but at the time it never been done. That was to do a reenactment, to jog people's memories, because he did have some information about screams from people in the street that she was taken from, and also tail lights of a car. So he wanted to sort of, I think, 2 things: keep the media engaged for the next 5 days leading into the reenactment the following Sunday, but also for timing, to see if those witnesses were right. So I went out with her 2 girlfriends that were with her that night. They'd finished their shift and gone into Chinatown for a meal. Then she left and caught the train back to Blacktown. So I went with the 2 girlfriends. I'm sure that was such a difficult task for them, to take me and find clothes similar to what that she was wearing, which were a pair of ballet shoes in a way, a pair of ski pants that had like the loop under the leg, and a T-shirt. On that Sunday, I went to Central Railway Station with Graham and a team of detectives, and then I just got on the train that they thought she'd got on, with the media allowed to follow me every step of the way. And they did that because they knew it was a gimmick in a way. Got off at Blacktown, and at that stage, Graham said to the media, who were very respectful, "We want you to stop now. We need you to stay here and not follow us any further." And so from there, Graham asked me to walk the route just on my own where they thought she went. And they were following in cars about 300 metres behind me, I guess. They wanted to get what was the lighting like, what was the feeling like, what was the traffic light. And then they asked me to stop exactly where they thought that witnesses had heard screams or saw the tail lights. And I was asked to stop there and just stop while they did their, looking around. And I remember people say to me, "How did you feel?" Well, up until that point, it was really part of the team, so just doing a job in a way, until I got to that point. And at that point, when it was just getting on dark and it was really quiet, and I just remember taking in the atmosphere and thinking At that time, when she was walking home very innocently had a lovely night out, was going away, I think, the next day on a trip with her estranged husband, probably not a care in the world. And then suddenly a car comes down the street, does a U-turn, pulls up beside her, and life at that point is almost over, but dragged on. So my thoughts were, when they dragged her into that car and then took her to a service station where they bought some cigarettes, and then drove a little further, which would have been, to do all that would have been about maybe half an hour, and then taking her into the paddock where they, raped her continually for God knows how long before they finally killed her. There's no doubt in the world from what the evidence is that she fought with every inch of her life. And I remember thinking, what was the terror she must have felt in those first minutes that dragged on to perhaps hours, the terror that a single person could feel. I couldn't imagine that. And so that sort of was for me, again, that even though I was very junior, I remember looking at these detectives, and when Graham gave me the offer later on to stay with the team, I didn't have really much to offer at that stage from an investigative point of view. I was very inexperienced. But I remember thinking, this is an opportunity to stay with these men on this case. I'll grab it with both hands.
Standing there, like you said, on the side of the road on your own, and even though it's a reenactment, as a young woman yourself at that age, of similar age to what Anita was, to be standing there, goodness me, what a surreal feeling that must have been, but almost impossible not to, like you say, try to imagine what that terror, that awful, awful confrontation must have been like for her. Did it have the desired effect, Deb? Did it spark any information that came forward? Obviously, the media would have been all around that. Did anything come forward as a result of that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have?
Absolutely. There was so many people that responded. Everyone was touched by this case, understandably, the horror. And, of course, Graham won't say too much about understandably, but it was a very confidential piece of information that Graham got, my understanding. And that was from someone that I certainly don't know, and I don't think even Graham might have even known who the identity was. It was a tip-off, for want of a better word. And it was for someone to say, if you've got nothing else, perhaps you should look at these five, the three Murphy brothers, John Travis and Michael Murdoch, because they were at a party, my understanding, and in a nearby suburb, and were supposed to return to the party after doing a crime to make some money. They didn't. And the tip-off was, if you've got nothing else, they didn't come back to the party, which is suspicious in itself. Maybe just look there. So Graham, having nothing, put all focus on these five. And within 3 weeks, they were arrested and charged with her kidnapping and murder.
Three brothers, like you say, Deb, the Murphy brothers, aged 33, 28, 22, Michael Murdoch and John Travis, who was clearly the ringleader. John Travis, I think it's quite reasonable to say, was nothing short of an absolute psychopath and terrible human being, as perhaps they all were. They all received life imprisonment, sent to prison for the term of their natural life. Now, this was at a time where in New South Wales, judicial life imprisonment wasn't actually for the term of their natural lives. And I think I'm right in saying, Deb, I think it was 91, 92, Truth in Sentencing, they went back to court and actually got recommitted to spend the rest of their natural lives in prison, being that they will die in prison, as opposed to sort of a 15, 20, 25-year judicial life sentence. Is that correct?
Yeah, Justice Maxwell, who was an amazing judge, and again, I played a minor role, just, driving witnesses to court and things like that. Justice Maxwell was an older judge, and I think it took his toll, and I think he retired not long after. And I remember he said words very similar to, and of course there on that day, I show you all the same mercy that you showed Anita Lorraine Cobby that night. I show you no mercy, and I sentence you to never to be released. I remember the scenes in the courtroom. People stood and cheered and high-fived, and back out on the streets at Blacktown, there was, it was almost like those scenes you see after, the World War II, people running down the street and embracing. I think Gary and Grace, in their wisdom, although, a couple from Blacktown, They were two of the strongest and wise people that I've ever had the honour to be part of their lives.
This is Mum and Dad, isn't it, Deb? Gary and Grace.
Mum and Dad, sorry, Gary and Grace. And I think that troubled them in a way, because that sentence of never to be released is a bit of a sentence that doesn't have a beginning or an end. And I think that worried them, that when they passed on, when the file becomes just a file, what would happen? So you're right, truth in sentencing, and they were a big part of that through their lobbying about law reform, as many others were, of course, to bring in truth in sentencing. So the 5 killers of Anita were brought back to be resentenced under legislation to life without parole. Because today people get the head sentence, which is the longest sentence, and then they get a parole period as well. So they were brought back to not eligible for parole.
And as you said, Grace and Gary Lynch, Anita's mum and dad, very, very instrumental in that. And I think Gary, Anita's father, went on to be a member of the New South Wales Parole Board. Is that correct, Deb?
Yeah, before, my understanding is historically that parole boards were generally, I think, for want of a better word, bureaucrats, and decisions were made, well-intentioned and no doubt very wisely. But Gary was always concerned that there was no community representative to show some transparency, or a victim to have their words, to their thoughts at least considered. So Gary became the very first member of the community and more or less a victim of crime on the parole board, which is now legislated, and there must always be. In fact, I'm very honoured to say that on the 1st of October, I take up one of those positions as a community representative.
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic, Deb. And you mentioned that working with Graham Rosetta and that team and having that experience very much sparked for you that interest in detective work and in investigative work. Also, possibly, could I say, the value perhaps in utilising the media in cases like this. And I'd put my neck out, Deb, and say as you became more senior, made your way through the ranks, were there times where you drew back on that experience and what Graham Rosetta did in the Cobby case? Were you able to use the media in investigations moving forward yourself?
Absolutely, and I think it's a credit to. It's a fine line, I guess, dealing with the media, because there's a saying, they're either at your throat or at your feet. And I think what I always did, and some journalists have come back to me over the years, in an unofficial capacity, has said, you always played a straight bat. I never gave scoops or inside information to people. I felt I needed to play a straight bat so that I didn't make enemies of the media as well, because they're a very powerful tool. But of course, when we needed the messages to get out there, I think I had a good relationship with the media in that sometimes the fear of crime is enough to make people feel in the community really unsafe. So the media play a very important role in a way hosing that down so we can get the facts out, because police are very limited in what they can say when they're investigating things. So it's really frustrating at times because the media want us to say more, but sometimes you just can't, because there's people's lives at stake, or you're on that you've got someone in your sights and you can't give too much away. So it's that fine balance of saying how much can we give and how much can we not give. And we often say to the media who might want to print something, can you not do that? And I have to say, very responsible journalists that I had the pleasure to be involved with always understood when we'd say, please don't run that. It's not worth the headline.
Coming up, changing laws to undermine the authority and influence of outlaw motorcycle gangs.
Let's go forward to 1994, a transfer for you across to Cabramatta. I don't think it's being melodramatic to say mid to late 90s, Cabramatta would have been perhaps labelled the crime capital of Australia at the time. You started working within the Asian gangs in Cabramatta around that time, particularly a very large gang by the name of 5T, which was a large street gang, mostly made up of young kids who'd immigrated without family, often no English skills. And it starts out, as often these movements do, as low-level crime, and then started to escalate into sort of more organised type drug dealing, Class A heroin and that type of thing. Deb, I'd be very interested in you walking us through your connection with the gang, and you did some wonderful work in trying to prevent some of the younger kids in the area migrating through to become members.
Yeah, I got to Cabramatta in 1990, and it was sort of a lot of people didn't know about what was going on out there because there was not many detectives out there. The community, which was largely South Vietnamese refugees, with some, of course, from Cambodia and Laos, but generally that would be the fear was South Vietnamese. And they were very tolerant of crime and didn't understand. They were first generation. They didn't understand our laws, et cetera, et cetera. So they didn't really make a noise politically. It built up over those next few years. There was lots of street fighting and usual stuff that goes with that, sort of, with Cabramatta being selling heroin. It was a bit of a controlled market because our heroin was being sold to sort of the Western Suburbs people, whereas prior to 94, the biggest area was King's Cross, really, for the state, I suppose, for selling heroin, known as that's where you went to the cross to get your gear. Mm. Something happened in 94, which was firstly we had the political assassination of John Newman, so that the spotlight starts to turn onto Cabramatta. There was a fair bit of conjecture whether it was the 5T gang that took him out because Mr. Newman was very vocal about sending them back and knowing that could never happen because they were refugees. The investigators who did that pretty well ruled that out fairly quickly. And then it moved on to being, of course, Fong Ngo was convicted. It was certainly over just, political rivals. But the spotlight became on Cabramatta. About the same time, we were running street operations, as you do. We were asked to compare the Cabramatta heroin with the King's Cross heroin. So when we would seize drugs, we would get everyone tested to see what our heroin was to the King's Cross heroin. It turns out ours was half the price and 5 times stronger. And because I think the street soldiers, the Vietnamese, had a direct line through the importers. So, of course, we thought, I hope no one finds out about this because, boy, it'll explode. Well, I remember the article in one of the tabloids and it said, the Smack Express. It was a double-page spread and it outlined the purity that we had. So all roads led to Cabramatta and all that goes with that.
You could shoot a shotgun up Darlinghurst Road at that point.
Yeah.
They're all
every train was loaded with. So, of course, the street gangs then, increased because there was more heroin, there's more customers, blah, blah. Around the same time, only not long after Mr. Newman was murdered, the leader of that street gang, the 5T gang, was a very charismatic leader with a lot of power. There's some suggestion that he wanted to move away from selling heroin because he was concerned his own community would start using it. At that stage, they were pretty well drug-free of heroin. He could see the signs of the younger street runners starting to taste the heroin. So some suggestion he wanted out, which meant those that relied on him to distribute would hurt business. So he was murdered. And so was the person with him, his lieutenant. So, of course, at that stage now, politically, Cabramatta's now under the spotlight. A political assassination, murder, all these murders, all these drugs, blah, blah. My boss at the time was a man called, he was a chief superintendent at the time, Paul McKinnon, was no doubt dragged into town. And whatever was said, he came out of that meeting with the commissioner and no doubt some high-ranking, maybe some politicians, I don't know who was there, but said to me, we need to take the streets back. And I said, we've been trying. And he said, no, I've got a plan. And I said, what's the plan? He said, well, I'm announcing the Cabramatta Gang Squad. And I went, that's fantastic. More resources, we get more police here, people that are focusing. He just looked at me and said, what are you raving on about? And I said, we're bringing these specially trained, highly skilled investigators and tactical police. He went, where would I get the resources from to do that? Congratulations, you're now the commander of Cabramatta Gang Squad.
It's just you.
And
yeah.
I was a young sergeant. And I said, this could be the shortest career in history. He said, don't worry, I'll give you some stuff, but you can't have trained detectives. You've got to have young uniform cops with you. So, that's going to be even better, thank you. I got the best group of cops you could ever ask for. I was so blessed. But Paul also, or Mr. McKinnon at the time I called him, gave me a book as well to read and said, Wallace, if you get stuck, read that. And he just threw it across. He was a man of few words. And it was Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And I thought, how's that going to help me? So I had a read and it was quite interesting. And one of the things it said was water is stronger than rocks. In other words, go by stealth and, all that sort of stuff. But one of the things was, before you can defeat your enemy, you must know them. And that resonated with me because as much as I thought I knew this, these gangs, we've been locking them up for, 5 years, did I really understand them? So I went out and approached them, and the first thing they said was, because we always had a fairly interesting relationship with them, it was very amicable in a way. Their view was, we do the crime, we do the time, you get us, we lock us up, that's the way it goes. And I told them about my new job, and they laughed a bit and said, how are you going to break us up? Although we're vulnerable, they said, our leader's dead, so we are a snake without a head. At the moment, we're weak, we're weakened, we have no brain, but we will grow a new one soon. So you need to get us while we're weak. And I thought that was really insightful, telling me how I could do it. But then they said, you know what, 3 things will happen to us as senior gang members. And that is, we will get killed, because that's what happens when you join a gang. We'll go to jail because you'll still do your job and lock us up. Or if we're lucky to survive the first 2, we may just grow up and grow out. And you may cut the grass, but there's weeds to come through. And all this is very, very philosophical. And I said,
very philosophical.
Yes. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, there's a group of young boys following us as role models, and they feel they don't need to go to school. The reason we are a gang is because we came from refugee camps, and we made our way here. Often we're the oldest boy who our family could afford to get us out of Vietnam, and we don't have family here. So we bonded together, and yes, we did crime because we have no choice in a way. We're not excusing ourselves, but that's how life was. The challenge for you to stop the cycle is to give the ones coming through education, because with education there's hope. With hope, they get a job, and then they go on not to do crime. So that sounded pretty good. Take that, point 1, I'll do that. I went around to our amazing schools in the area who were just the best, Cabramatta High and Canley Vale High. And they said, Deb, as long as we'd love to help you, you've got to understand these kids are on the street and they don't speak English. What do we do with them? I understood. So with that dilemma and them saying, you big talker, you promised you'd get them in school, but you're not fulfilling. And about that time, a dear friend of mine who's been a friend since 1995, Father Chris Riley from Youth Off the Streets, made his way to Cabramatta and introduced himself. And all I could think of at the time was, oh, God, another do-gooder. That's just what I need right now. He said to me very simply, and he was really cool. He had his black shirt on, and he had his collar, and he had a pair of Levi jeans that still had, I think, hay from his farm. He had cowboy boots that looked like they'd never been cleaned. And he said, let me meet them. And I don't know what made me say it to him, but I said, Father, can you get rid of the collar? And I don't know why I said it. He went, what for? And I said, well, I don't know, but, let's just go up without the collar. And he went, all right. He's looking at me like I'm an idiot. We went up and I introduced them to him. And out of absolute respect, they said, which I always loved Father, because Father's only 8 years older than me, but they said, is he your father? I said, yeah, Father looked a bit disgruntled at the time. And he said, no, I'm a registered school, because I was the principal of Boys Town, and then I went onto the streets of the Cross, so I can bring the school to you. And they looked with open eyes and said, you teach us here. And he said, I will teach you here. But there's a condition, and the condition is we will do it here in this open-air cafe, but they used to call me Madam, but Madam will be here every minute, because there will be no drug sailing, no machete attacks. For the 3 hours, 3 days a week that we will do this, it's like Switzerland. And they agreed. So we did that 3 days, 3 hours, until eventually we had an opportunity to take the young ones down to his farms on the Southern Highlands to disengage them from the gangs. And the gangs supported that. And from those group of 8 that we took, I managed to track them, not continually because they needed to do their own thing, but they never committed a crime when they returned. And they're now productive members of society.
So, Deb, operationally, how did that sit? On the one hand, you're in there trying to create rapport and, in fact, trying to assist some of the young ones in not moving into that environment. On the other hand, you're a police officer and you're dealing with gangs who are distributing heroin, dishing out street justice, breaking a plethora of crimes on a daily basis. How was that balance achieved, both operationally and for you personally?
It had a priority. First and foremost, I was a cop. And they knew that. I laid the ground rules out really early and said, if we're going to do this thing with the school, do not confuse kindness with weakness. After we do our 3 hours, if you do one step out of line in those 3 hours, it's game off. You make the call, it's game off. But after the 3 hours, you will go back to business and so will I. So the ground rules were laid really early. So, yep, first priority for me was a cop. You step out of line, you do a crime, you're going to get locked up. There was no if and buts.
So all black and white, and there's that sort of interesting, there's that sort of respect, isn't there, between the gangs, particularly the higher echelon of the gang in this particular situation, and someone like yourself. There's the respect that you've got a job to do, but also at the same time you're trying to help them. But I love that quote, Deb, from you. Don't confuse kindness with weakness. It sort of sums up the position, doesn't it?
Yeah, there was that, and we were outnumbered by them. So in a way, we weren't going to antagonise them more than we had to. And I remember on numerous times I'd walk. I remember on a Friday night I had a really bad head cold. I was on shift, and I had to get up to that chemist to get some Sudafed. I don't know if they still have Sudafed these days. And I got out of my car and I'm just walking to the chemist. It was like 50 metres, 100 metres. And two gang members got on either side of me. And they said, "Madam, where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to the chemist. I've got a head cold." And they said, "Madam, you shouldn't walk the streets of Cabramatta at night. It's a very dangerous place." And I said, "Well, you're the only ones I need to worry about." They went,
Yeah.
"Oh, yeah, but you don't have to worry about us. We'll walk you back." And, yeah, so that's sort of the way it was.
The leverage there, Deb, was to provide sort of hopes, education, give them something to focus on. And interestingly, from what you're saying, that information was given to you by those in the gang who sort of through their own admission, are almost beyond sort of reproach that there's no point trying to help us, we're gone, but the grass, the weeds scenario, you've got to do something there. And that's a big change, I'm sure, at the time, and how particularly, say, a gang as high profile as 5T were policed. Did you get some strange looks going back into Cabramatta Station? Did you get some pushback from the local command?
Absolutely, I did, and it was sort of said to me that it wasn't my role as a social worker. I'm not a social worker. I'm a cop. Lock them up. Mr. McKinnon supported me, and I was so grateful because I felt quite isolated, and it was his words of encouragement to say, "Why do you think I gave?" And years later, not at the time, but years later, because a young sergeant running a street gang unit was sort of a big challenge, and it really did cement my credibility that I wanted to be a street cop. I went to him because the Royal Commission was sitting at the time. Allegations were made that I was the new leader of the 5T because of the relationship I had with them and the meetings I had with them. The Royal Commission investigators didn't really understand what I was doing, and it was all very cloak and dagger and a whole lot of things. And they asked to meet with me privately. They'd actually gone to the snooker hall where the gang hang out, and the investigators handed the gang members their cards and said, "We want to talk to you about Madam. Do you give her money?" And they looked at him and went, "Well, she drives a really bad car with no paint on it. Do you think if we give her money she'd buy a better car?" But they turned up at the police station, the gang members, and handed me their card and said, "We don't know, Madam, what's going on, but these people came to our snooker hall and asked about you, but we don't understand what's going on, but here's their card." And it was from the Royal Commission. And so I rang Paul. I got a short phone call shortly after that. Paul said, "Don't meet with them." And I said, "Well, they've just told me I'm not allowed to tell anyone that, that I've got to meet with them." And he said, "Well, and I've broken every rule by ringing you." He said, "Stand down, calm down, I'll ring them." And he rang them. And to their credit, the next day they rang me and apologised and said, "We're sorry, we were given misinformation, but watch your back." And I said, "I'll never speak to another gang member as long as I live." And they said,
dear. But how fickle that whole process is, Deb. Had you not had that support from that McKinnon that far up the chain, could have been a totally different outcome.
Yeah, and look, I understood totally where the cops were coming from. And in a way, I was lucky that I was a female because there was no expectations around that I had to do it the way we've always done it. I was given that freedom to think a little differently, and I'm a very strong believer in crime prevention. At the end of the day, cops have to lock up the crooks. That's their role. But if we can prevent it in the first place, you save so much money for the community and for the people involved. Today, crime prevention is part of our DNA. I'm not in anymore, but part of the cops. I think everything they do has a strong prevention focus, intervention, disruption focus, not just prosecution.
So, Deb, Task Force Raptor was created 2009 as a reaction to a gang-related murder at Sydney Airport, domestic airport, broad daylight, families, what have you, exceedingly violent confrontation at the airport. Can you just share some of that detail with us, Deb?
There was a group coming back from Melbourne on the plane, one group coming back, one other opposing gang on the flight as well. Rings ahead, there's a whole bunch of Hells Angels here, get the boys together, we'll be waiting at the airport for whatever reason other than they're just, we're a commos, you're Hells Angels and we don't like each other. They probably don't even know why. And sure enough, they get off, they're walking through the terminal, it's a public place, like domestic terminal, crowded, children, families, holiday makers. And these idiots decide to punch on and bash each other and one picks up a bollard and hits the other one and he dies. And of course, a number of people all get charged with that, including Mick Howie gets charged with his murder, which was later dropped to manslaughter, and he does time for all that, as do a number of others for their involvement in the whole scenario. That's the kick-off, because I think the outrage was, we all know bikies hate each other and they'll discriminate use of violence, we know that. But suddenly, through no obvious reason, they're doing it, disregard. If there can be this brazen at an airport, what's next? So it's a bit like anything, a catalyst for something to be done.
And there's the line that's been crossed, isn't it, Deb? I mean, police are well aware of the violence that goes on between the gangs and that type of thing, but to take that absolutely senseless violence into a scene like a domestic airport, I don't know what day of the week it was, but I remember the scenes. It was sort of during the day. There was families there, like you say, kids, and probably a blessing that there was probably only one that was deceased as a result of that. Mick Howie, I think, head of the Comancheros at the time, or close to it, and this led to the formation of a Strike Force Raptor. This was set up in 2009. Around that time, Deb, my understanding is that you were promoted to superintendent. You were the commander of the Asian Organised Crime Unit, also worked in the Middle Eastern Organised Crime, I think, for a period of 7 years. 2014, you became the commander of Strike Force Raptor. That's my understanding, whose brief really in that context was to work with outlaw motorcycle gangs, bikie gangs, to disrupt, disband and dismantle these gangs. Deb, can you share with us your involvement there from 2014?
Yeah, I was I asked to go across there because I'd been at Middle Eastern Organised Crime for 8 years before that, and I really loved that model of disruption and dismantling through using investigative skills, tactical police and a highway patrol. So that was the model we used following on from the Middle Eastern. So going across to Strike Force Raptor and the gang squad was, for me, a natural progression. That's what I believed in. When I got there, I knew a lot about Asian crime. I knew a fair bit now about Middle Eastern organised crime, well, maybe disorganised crime. But outlaw motorcycle gangs was a new world for me. So I think what I'd learned early on in my career is don't pretend you know something if you don't. You're not the expert of all things, neither should you be. Rely on those that do and let them teach you. So I got together the amazing teams that had been doing amazing work through their proactivity. And we just nutted out a few different things. I said to them, tell me about what a bikie looks like, what their psyche is, what their business model is, what's their culture, what's their ethos, what do they like the best, what do they do, so that I can get my head around it. And we highlighted a number of those things, just like whiteboard it, for want of a better word. And then the team decided that the best way we can disrupt them is to take out all those things that they liked. Now, that was going to be a challenge because you needed different laws, perhaps, to take out different things. So we set about using our term was consequence-based policing approach. If you do crime, you're going to pay the consequence. Whether you can drive a car, it'll affect whether you can put up DA approval, whether you can have a clubhouse. And we used different laws and got amendments to laws. The government, when we approached them, were very receptive to amending the laws that we needed to combat them. In fact, one of the most powerful ones was the consorting legislation, which was an old piece of legislation from the 1920s used for the razor gangs around King's Cross at the time. and we modified it to fit the modern times.
And when you say consorting laws, these are laws that prohibited known criminals from associating with each other. And I think, as you said, these were established in the 20s. And what you did was you sort of dusted those laws off, but perhaps started to also apply them to use of social media, phones and that type of thing. Is that sort of how you modernised those laws?
Yeah, before it was association had to meet, hence why they have bikie clubhouses. That was their thing, because we meet behind closed doors. We can plot criminal activity, hence all that sort of stuff is a different piece of legislation. But the consorting was, we need to associate, because bikies, in my view, aren't individuals who do crime. They need their banner and they need their group to put fear in people. As an individual, they're a never nobody. So if we could take out the ability to associate, like such in bikie runs, which was the run down the highway on their bikes with their colours on. So the new legislation was exactly what you said. It wasn't just meeting in person, because we know people now use phones and texts and social media, and so it encapsulated all of that. It was very powerful, in fact so powerful that 3 nomads took us to the High Court to challenge us on a constitutional challenge of the right of people to associate. We sort of held our breath, because we knew this was a very good crime prevention tool, that if they couldn't associate, they couldn't plot, they couldn't do runs. And I remember they took us in October of 2014 to the High Court. Now, the Rebels, the biggest bikie gang at the time in Australia, was due to have their national run from Sydney to Coffs Harbour that very weekend in October. So it was a big thing, thousands turning up, or 1,000 or whatever, and pay their bit, and off they go up the highway, putting fear in people, no doubt. So they took us to the High Court. The nomads took us to the High Court on the Thursday. And on that day, well, they took us some months before, of course, but the decision was handed down on the Thursday before that run to say that the legislation was validated. So we put out, well, now we're out. We're going to take yous all on. And we even set up mobile police stations ready to go. Even though with consorting you have to warn people first. But they were so nervous of this legislation, because we hadn't really applied it, because we knew with the constitutional challenge, what's the point of applying a law that's under challenge? But now the gloves are off and we can apply this. So they basically cancelled the run. And that was a watershed moment for us, because from that time on, through the work of Raptor, dismantling them and being there, being in their faces, national runs were a thing of the past for New South Wales.
Now, another area that you worked on, which I thought was brilliant in its simplicity, were council laws, bylaws. And as we all know, goodness me, if you want to put up a shed in your backyard, you've got to jump through 1,000 hoops with local council to get approval. These gangs have gang homes, often fortified. They have clubhouses. They have surveillance cameras. They have fences that are probably 4 metres high, barbed wire, the whole 9 yards. You looked at those and thought the old death by 1,000 cuts, I think, is the principle. Did they get council approval for those cameras? Did they get council approval to have that fence? This is another approach, Deb?
Yeah, absolutely, because, they living their world, in the world of rivalry and all that sort of stuff, drive-by shooting. So they'd build these, big fences with, security gates and blah, blah. So absolutely, that was just one other thing that we hit them with DAs. The other thing was, which I thought was pretty good, one of the guys come up with, dismantling their clubhouses was brilliant. That was a sergeant came up with that. That was brilliant. But the best one, another one was, we know if they're going to do revenge attacks or go and do runs, they've got to have a driver's license. So they went through the debt recovery office to say who had fines and who hadn't paid them and got their license cancelled. Things so small little things, but certainly makes, they have to drive to do a shooting.
Well, that's it. And these aren't blokes who are going to be racing up to pay those parking fines and minor speeding fines on time before the bailiff comes around. So they just, they don't care. So you get them on that, which means they lose their licence. And then it would follow, of course, that they're going to drive disqualified without a licence. So now they're driving disqualified. They've got a bit of criminal history. We're on the verge of some imprisonment time there almost, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. Or even just the cops know that, because with these great number plate detection things that brought in, so they're flagged. So you don't have to have 1,000 cops on the street. As soon as they drive past a mobile thing, bang, because we often knew which way they'd go to their businesses or their school pickups or whatever.
And of course, hand in hand with this, Deb, I listened to a wonderful interview you did recently, and you said, of course, it wasn't all just this. This approach went hand in hand with some other more old school, hard-nosed policing, going in through the front door of these houses, these clubhouses, doing warrants for drugs and things such as that. We were talking off air before. I had a couple of years in the riot squad in New Zealand back in the 80s, and 80-90% of the work was dealing with the gangs over there. And I'd read with such interest some years ago a Sydney Morning Herald article about Task Force Raptor, and what you've just described. I sat there with a big smile on my face thinking, goodness me, it's so simple but so effective. And I look back at the time that I was dealing with the gangs and how if we'd had this additional string to our bow, how even more effective that police sort of presence would have been. But didn't you also do something, Ded, with local licensees where they agreed to not allow anyone in wearing their colours, those patches, so they couldn't come in with the patches on trying to intimidate everybody?
Yeah, one of our inspectors, and in fact it was when I first got there at Raptor, we had a meeting with, there was a lot of big presence of the Hells Angels in the Cabramatta area. And they would do their bit. They'd go in and sit down in their, fancy dress outfits, all their, oh heavens, which I disrespected their colours, and sit down in their colours. And they're not doing anything, so to speak. But, if they've got people next door with a family having dinner, it's pretty intimidating to see a table of 10 of Hells Angels. So I asked this naive question about, well, why are they allowed to sit there in their colours? They said, because it's not unlawful. And I thought about that. And so I had a great inspector I had two amazing team. Let me tell you, I had the best team. He'd come up with ideas. I'd come, as soon as they put in my office, I go, now what are we going to do? And he was named Detective Chief Inspector Darren Beach. He got himself on the liquor accord, which is where licensees and police meet to make sure that licensed premises are safe for people, blah, blah. And they came up with this thing that they'd have, part of the liquor licence would be that colours are banned from liquor licensed premises as part of their liquor licence. So we would support, of course, because some would try it on and walk in, and the publicans and the licensees were fantastic in reinforcing. And we said to them, blame us, like, just tell them they have to leave because the cops will be around.
Yeah, third party it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and it was brilliant because, there they are, might have their, because there was no more clubhouses, just about, they then go, well, let's go to the local pub for our meetings. But of course, they couldn't wear their colours, so it wasn't much fun now.
They're going to have to walk because none of them have got a licence.
Well, and it's a bit of an identity crisis, just walking in as a group. It's not nearly as fun as intimidating people with your colours on.
Yeah. It's a funny old thing, isn't it? I mean, you can't simplify it too much, but in my experience dealing with the gangs and, individually, one-on-one, you can talk a bit of sense to them, but it's, collectively, of course, they're a different beast to deal with. And they've got all the colours and all the mean stickers, the tattoos and all the rest of the carry-on. But in my experience, you're often dealing with the mentality of a 13 or 14-year-old sort of juvenile when you're dealing with some of these individuals. And I am sure that a lot of them would have really battled with this whole process as to how they're going to deal with it. And I guess, Deb, the proof's in the pudding. Did this work? Did this approach? Did this chipping away, this death by 1,000 cuts? Did you win out? Did you have the success that you'd anticipated?
It's funny, when you do proactive policing, and nowhere in the world can you measure the crime you prevent, I guess, taking it from that. So we look at, how did I measure it? Well, firstly, suddenly their visibility was gone and people were saying, we're not seeing them around. They couldn't have national runs in New South Wales. Disrupting them, absolutely. You started to see those senior members move offshore. Fantastic, because the environment was so hot. I think one of the biggest breakthroughs we had was, yes, we're doing it really good and we're doing all this and it's great, we're getting these great laws, but then we'd see from South Australia, what have you got? Oh, we've got firearm prohibition orders. Well, we'd like those. Well, can we have your consorting? So we ended up forming like a board of directors for my counterparts all around the country, and we would talk purely operations, got rid of the bureaucracy and talked what we could do. And that went further to get the federal counterparts. And then you're opening a whole new world, because now you've got taxation, now you've got Centrelink, now you've got immigration. It was fantastic. So I think the proof was there. People often say, oh, well, we're just a bunch of guys getting together. The Gladiators are a good example up at the Maitland Way. They tell me they're the oldest biker gang in Australia. Their banner, 1963 or something. Great bunch of guys that I met, the older guys. And they had this magnificent clubhouse, like an RSL. Unbelievable, this magnificent pool, that had their logo in little tiny tiles on the bottom. And I said to them when we're raiding them and taking out their clubhouse, why don't you guys drop the 1% and be a social club? Because you've got all this memorabilia, just be a social club. Because by declaring yourselves as outlaws, you're declaring yourself. We're going to come after you because you've declared it. So, I don't have a great deal of sympathy for outlaw motorcycle gangs because they're the ones that declare themselves as criminals. And our job's to bring them back inside the law. A couple of things I learned early in my career was it's okay to say I don't know and it's okay to say I need help.
Yeah, fantastic.
So you can imagine how proud I was one day when a sergeant and a senior constable from Raptor walked into my office and said, Deb, we've got them on the run. We're doing all this great stuff. There's no more clubhouses. We've got no runs. Now what we want to do gang prevention programs and we want to go into the detention centres. And they did. And today, those same police do it in their own time, still with the detention centre.
Wow, isn't that fantastic? And that harkens back, Deb, to the success that you had with the 5T, the young fellas there at, down the streets of Cabramatta. Different gang, but same principles apply, I guess, in some regards, particularly with those younger ones.
Yeah, the established gangs aren't going to do it themselves. They need, for want of a better word, cannon fodder, and they target the vulnerable youth and say, "Look, come with us, bro. Look what we can give you." It's pretty sexy, girls, drugs,
So, Deb, a stellar 36-year career comes to a close with retirement in 2019. Since that time, you've been very busy on a volunteer basis in a number of different groups, organisations, one being Grace's Place, a group started by Gary and Grace Lynch, the parents of Anita Cobby. Deb, can you just share with us your role there and perhaps in some of the other environments that you work with in a voluntary role?
Yeah, I retired just before COVID hit. So I thought, oh, heavens, I've gone. And I was one of the very lucky ones that was able to retire mentally and physically fit. And so I remember my last day was the 13th of December 2019, and the Raptor guys are still kicking doors in that night. So I'm actually don't finish until midnight on the 13th. So they're still sending me orders. So I'm still approving orders, and suddenly midnight happens and all of my electronics and access goes. So it was a bit of like going from 24/7 to nothing. So I knew that, and then COVID, but I knew I had to do something. It's just, I suppose that's typical what cops do. We've been given, work for the public service, but really we're servants of the public. So I needed to do that. So I do Meals on Wheels, which is ironic because I do not cook at all, but rest assured, all the people that receive them in the Lake Macquarie area, I only peel potatoes because I'm not very good at anything else. And I went on board the local workers club at Swansea. And, of course, the other labour of love is Gary and Grace Lynch. I became very close to, not initially after Anita's murder. It wasn't until some years later that we reconnected. And I could imagine what they were doing with the homicide, being the original founders with Peter and Christine Simpson, another family who suffered tragedy with little Ebony in 92. So they became the founders to help other families. And Gary and Grace became my friends. And we'd share birthdays, as did with Catherine, their daughter. And they were doing amazing stuff. And it wasn't until Gary died, he was 90, and Grace died a few years later, she was 87. And I think in a way she often would say how as much as she was proud of what they did, turning something so bad into something supportive for other families, she had a special focus with children. And on her death, through Martha Jabal, the wonderful CEO of Homicide Victim Support, and all the wonderful families who over the years have just bonded like a real family themselves, said, well, you know what, let's turn her dream, I guess, or her, if anything, a regret, into a reality. So we went about for 7 years fundraising, and we're now pleased to say on the 2nd of February this year, the anniversary of Anita's murder, we had the official opening of a world's first trauma centre and residential centre built at Doonside, not far from where Anita and Gary and Grace lived, which is where children can go following a homicide. Instead of going to a motel room, to get away from the crime scene or the media, this is a sort of a respite place where it's filled with love and manned by volunteers and fantastic psychologists who give their time. And children can go there and can be given fantastic support and love. And, of course, it's appropriately called Grace's Place.
Deb, it has been such a pleasure to meet with you and have a chat, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come into the studio. 36 years of serving the good people of New South Wales, and the bulk of it very much at the sharp end amongst some of the toughest criminals in the state. Deb, it's just been such a pleasure to chat with you, and I want to just thank you sincerely so much for your service, and thank you for spending some time with us here this afternoon.
Thank you, Brent. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search Listener Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.